everyone. My name is Mary Hartman, and I'm Director of Education for Bard on the Beach. In an ordinary summer, as many of you know very well, Bard on the Beach is a Shakespeare festival performing 4 plays for about 100,000 patrons in a truly magnificent place called Snock. On the waterfront in the heart of what we now call Vancouver, Snock has a rich, vibrant, and very long history as a place of gathering and storytelling. At the moment, of course, we must content ourselves with gathering in a virtual space, but we are still gathering, and that is a powerful thing. I invite you all to take a moment, wherever you are, to appreciate the history, culture, and spirit of that place, and your connection to it. We at Bard on the Beach are on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Now, I'd like to introduce to you a brilliant collaborator, Dr. Paul Boudra. We started working together on the Bard Explored series in 2009 because we appreciated the fact that the patrons of our Shakespeare Festival were inquisitive, engaged, and eager to learn more about the plays they loved. Our series of Saturday morning talks drew committed regulars while welcoming newcomers to fulfill our central mission at Bard on the Beach, inspiring community. I can't wait till we can all gather in person again. In the meantime, I'm grateful for this. For those of you who've attended Bard Explored, you know how brilliant Paul is. And for those of you who are new, I'm excited to introduce you to him. Paul is professor of English at Simon Fraser University, where he teaches Shakespeare and early modern literature. He has served as chair of the English department and associate dean of the associate dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and is currently director of SFU Publications. He's won awards for teaching and has an impressive list of publications on both Renaissance literature and popular culture. And our Bard Explored patrons will certainly know what an engaging, inspiring speaker he is, sharing knowledge and offering insights with extraordinary wit and flair. I'll be back at the end to help with the Q&A, but now I'm delighted to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm blushing from that introduction. And I am so glad to be back at Bard on the Beach, giving the Bard Explored lectures for the past so many years has been the highlight of my summer every year. And I miss it. I miss all the people who come out regularly to the talks and the conversations I have with them. So this is going to have to do for now, and let us hope that we are back in the tents next year. So we're going to have the series of conversations, and this was Mary's idea that I would engage with important Shakespeare scholars and practitioners and give different perspectives to the world of Shakespeare and theater going. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker in this series of conversations, Dr. John Ray Proctor of Tulane University in New Orleans. Dr. Proctor completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, writing a thesis that considered the ways in which mid-20th century theater audiences learned to negotiate issues of class, race, and integration within the framework of a particular and very important 1942 production of Othello that starred Paul Robeson, the great singer, actor, athlete, and political activist. Now, besides being a scholar who's given keynote talks in places like Portsmouth, England, Dr. Proctor is a professional actor, a professional director, and playwright. He has played such characters as Shylock, Mercutio, and Othello, so he's a man of many theatrical talents and interests. Welcome, Ray, to Bard on the Beach.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul. I am humbled and honored to be here.
Well, it is wonderful to have you here. And let's start with just sort of a general, easy, slightly personal question. You're one of the few Shakespeare scholars I know who has so much hands-on theatrical experience. Now, how does that experience, walking the boards, your acting, your directing, inform your teaching and your scholarship of Shakespeare? What does it bring into the academic world and the classroom?
I'm a member of the Shakespeare Association of America, and we talk about this all the time. There are theorists, critical theorists. I have friends who are utterly amazing in the way they write about Shakespeare. I'm a practitioner, if you will. So I'm a Shakespeare practitioner. We always joke at SAA about those who think of Shakespeare as literature, those who take apart what's happening in the text. They're looking at the way words mean and the number of syllables in a line, and they're taking it apart from a literary critical standpoint. Oftentimes what I do is because I have a history, because I had a career as an actor on stage, I'm going to, so over the course of today, I'm going to use I want to divide two different ideas. Literary text and spectacle text. So the literary text are the words on the page that everybody gets in the book. And then the spectacle text is what we see on stage. Most of the work that I do approaches Shakespeare from the perspective of the spectacle text or the play in performance. I've approached that work as an actor and as a director. So does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. It's interesting. We talk about spectacle text because unfortunately, Shakespeare gives us so few clues in the text that we have inherited of what we're supposed to be seeing. Who is supposed to be standing where? What gestures are they making? You know, what's going on? And it's up to directors and people like you to figure that out.
Right. And I think that's the interesting thing. You just used what we're supposed to.
Right.
That phrasing is literally what the directors and the actors add to the text to move it from literary text to spectacle text. Mm-hmm. So the presupposition that there's anything you're supposed to see gets in the way of the creativity of what you could see and what you could create. That's my thought on that.
No, that's really interesting, and you're right. I stand corrected, because when my students, of course, they just read and say, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Well, this is supposed to be happening," but you're right. This is what could be happening, and think of certain moments in certain plays. The end of Measure for Measure. Does Isabella take the Duke's hand? He could, but she could. Yeah,
right, and in that moment, that's what the directors and the actors and the theater makers, the practitioners, are actually doing to the text. We have the ability to make the spectacle text say something different than what you might get in the literary text. We can critique upon the literary text through performance.
Which leads me to sort of the bigger question, or the first part of the big question, which comes out of that film, which Bard on the Beach produced, Done Undone, written by Kate Besworth. And that film explores a number of big questions about Shakespeare, but I think the overarching question, the one that sort of begins and resonates through the whole film is Shakespeare still relevant? Should we still be performing the plays of the archetypal dead white male 450 years after his heyday and playing them so often? I mean, try to find a major city in North America that doesn't have a Shakespeare festival. And if we do perform them, how should we, or how could we, in your language, perform them?
We are all products. If we hear, I can't speak for the entire world, but Western civilization. Let's just go with Western civilization.
Yeah, good idea. Let's narrow it down.
We all are a product of the colonial practices. We are all products of imperial practice. Where we are today, we have the critical resources to critique and question how we got here. We don't have to uncritically accept that everything's great. Like, that's the weirdest way to put it. But we don't have to we are allowed to question. So when I say we in the Western civilization, I'm talking about you and I'm talking about me. How do you and I become a part of a we? That's a part of the ideological structures and practices that have made us who we are today. But you and I hold different positions and places within that we. And sometimes we have to acknowledge that we are at different places, and those places get divided by gender, by class, by orientation, by education, by ability. And so we are at different places we occupy different spaces. Everybody here has a culturally specific place within the we, and we're not the same, right? So cool. Shakespeare, but we all get taught Shakespeare. I talk about this in I live in New Orleans. I'm in America. You are in Canada, and so I can't speak for how school works there, but as a part of, I oftentimes look to the work of Lawrence Levine, who wrote Highbrow, Lowbrow, and they talk about how we got upper class, lower class, what forms of art went to which of those.
Elite versus popular.
Elite versus popular. So at the turn of the century, at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, there was a movement of Shakespeare into elite institutions, and it was incorporated into our dominant educational practices. We could spend the rest of this interview talking about the how and why that happened. We can but for our purpose, let's just say it happened. When our educational systems start to teach everybody Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was the marker of civilized. Shakespeare was the marker of what it meant to be cultured. Shakespeare became the marker, or that hurdle that we all had to jump over to gain entry into civilized, cultured society. We all got taught that. I did, you did, women did, rich people did. And it's held up here, and people are like, can you do Shakespeare? Well, then you're not quite cultured. Can you do Shakespeare? Well, then you're not quite civilized. So as a marker of becoming civilized in our society, as a way of proving to our society that we have worth, that we have value, I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is the logic that gets us here. We had to pass the Shakespeare test to be gained admittance to the cultured circles or the society circles. That was the carrot stick that was set up for us. So Shakespeare got it's a part of our culture. And it exists. But I think as we've grown as a society and as culture, as cultures and societies, we are allowed to question our individual perspectives. We are allowed to question who we are and how we got here. As an African-American person who was raised in New Jersey, did I need Shakespeare? Did I ever need it? Who am I proving my worth to? Like, these are the questions that, who are you, who are not you, but who are you, society, elite society, to say to deny me? Do I want to be a part of your club? Right. And so there are choices we make. Do I want to be a part of your club? I made a choice to enter academia, so I had to pass the Shakespeare test to get into this club. But does everybody need to pass the Shakespeare test? I don't necessarily think so. But does that mean they shouldn't have it? No. We can do stuff. We can do all kinds of stuff with Shakespeare that the elite club never thought of.
So this whole idea of Shakespeare's cultural capital, right? A sort of thing you put in your back pocket. And I run into this all the time, and I see parents dragging their 4-year-olds to Shakespeare so that they can tell their friends, oh, my daughter loves Shakespeare. And again, it's this sort of signifier, right? You hit this bar. But again, in the movie Done Undone, I think that they dealt with it in an interesting way in that scene in which we have 2 theater goers at the end of Romeo and Juliet, and the woman loved the play, and the guy says, I don't get it. I don't even understand the language. And this sort of thing, your professed love of Shakespeare strikes me as a sort of elitism in our modern world, in which popular culture is become the sort of the base, right? We all go see Marvel superhero movies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I just throw it out. There are still people who think of Shakespeare as that marker of elitism and difficult and hard to get to.
So I was thinking as I was watching that section of Done Undone,
Mhm.
I think about jazz, I think about heavy metal, I think about death metal. Do we all need to understand jazz? No. Do we all need to understand death metal? No. And like, I think about Norwegian death metal. I have many students and I've been introduced to the concept of Norwegian death metal.
Mhm.
I don't know, I don't have the experience that makes me care one whit about Norwegian death metal.
Right.
I might go to my grave and never embrace why that's important.
Mhm.
Similarly, there are people who are going to go to their grave and never understand jazz.
Right.
Does that make them less than as people? I don't think so. It's just not for them. It's not an arena that they gain anything of substance from. And I think Shakespeare is different because culturally, he is that marker of mastery, if you will.
Yeah.
We use, like, as a cultural icon, Shakespeare is used to beat people over the head and say, you are less than because you don't know Shakespeare. And it achieved that status because it was made a part of our educational systems.
Yes.
So we didn't get the chance to avoid it.
Right. Right. Unlike Norwegian death metal, which we were not taught in high school. Right.
Right.
Exactly. I just have to throw out, my wife has a cousin who is a very important Norwegian death metal musician. She's Norwegian.
That's not true.
That is totally true. As to, my wife is Norwegian, and her cousin is like a big guy in the scene. Anyway, I don't listen to it very often. Okay. So let's swing back. Let's swing back to sort of more sort of immediate problems. Okay, we accept that Shakespeare is this, sort of universal thing. He's been taught in high schools forever, and whether or not people pursue that once they leave high school, if they just suffer through Shakespeare and forget him, or whether they embrace him later on, he still is the archetypal dead white male author. And we have these plays that have become the canon that are produced constantly. What do you think we should do with those parts of the plays that are sexist or racist or anti-Semitic? And this is something, of course, the theater companies are dealing with constantly these days.
I think plays have the ability to critique the world in which we exist. I think why we keep doing them, like, and that's an important part of this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we keep doing them? If they don't, unless they critique, unless we learn something, unless we gain something about ourselves and the world in which we currently exist. I don't need museum Shakespeare. I don't need to go back to the late 15, early 1600s to experience what the English audience, that's a museum piece. Mm-hmm. Theater is alive. Theater has the ability to touch people, to emotionally move people, to invoke catharsis. We are struggling every day to negotiate the world in which we exist. Racism, sexism, all of the things that are still here. So it's odd to do a play that invokes racist, sexist, misogynistic language, beliefs, practices, to do that here and pretend that those two things are not related. Seems wildly dangerous to me, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have problems. We have social problems right now. There are social issues right now. There are things that have changed. More people occupy the we the people now than ever have. These includes men, women, immigrants, gay people, Black people, LGBTQ, the entire alphabet mafia. We are all a part of we the people. Right. Then if we're telling a Shakespeare story, I think it's Bruce McConaughey who talks about when audiences identify themselves, audiences read plays through the process of identification. They're seeing their own experience on stage. So if I'm seeing the representation of a Black man on stage in the play Othello, I'm identifying with him if at the basis level I'm racially identifying with what that character is going through, surrounded by all those people. I'm seeing my story. I'm having like, call us selfish. We are reading it through, we are reading ourselves into that story. Is there racist language in Othello? Absolutely. But Othello was written somewhere near the earlier parts of the transatlantic slave trade. So what happened, and it's weird, the entire history of colonization and the transatlantic slave that happens after the writing of Othello informs my current reading of Othello, and it informs the audience's contemporary readings of Othello. So we are reading the whole history, or we're reading tangential knowledge of a history that is now being incorporated into that play. Do I take the racist parts of Othello out? No, because it doesn't make sense. It stops making sense. Like, the problem in Othello doesn't make sense if you take those parts out. The problem with Petruchio doesn't make sense if you take the misogynist parts out, if you take the abusive parts out. Then, so the play stops making sense if you take away what we identify as the problem. Then what do we do about it? We as theater makers, we as actors, directors, theater makers, if we're being cognizant of the ideological medium we are playing in, we have to then engage with that. What are we asking the audience? In what way are we asking the audience to engage with this thing? Be that misogyny or racism. Does it make any sense?
That makes total sense. And I love the fact that you say, we don't want museum Shakespeare. That's something it's a phrase I use all the time, because I say, we don't want Shakespeare to be a museum piece because things in museums are dead. All right. But I've seen many, many productions that deal with the plays that are more fraught, Othello or Merchant of Venice, Taming the Shrew. And I've seen two approaches. One is to change the tone of the play. No one's wants to laugh at the trial scene of Shylock anymore. That play has become the tragedy of Shylock at a certain extent. I've seen a production of The Taming of the Shrew, which is not a single laugh in it. It was a play about domestic violence. All right. So you can alter the tone. The other thing, though, I have seen a lot of is altering of the text, where, for example, the last production of Taming the Shrew done at Bar on the Beach, some of Petruchio's lines and Kate's lines were exchanged. They changed lines. It's a Two Gentlemen of Verona, where they changed the ending. And after the two dumb men say, "Oh, you were trying to rape my girlfriend. Ah, it's all right." The women just left. They just screw this, and they left. Is it okay to change the text? Because what you just said a few minutes ago would suggest that you wouldn't be in favor of that.
So yes, but you changed the text for a reason, not the words, but the spectacle text. A couple of years ago, there was a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the role Titania and Oberon. Titania, some of Oberon's, in fact, I do this. I do it with different characters, but Titania ends up saying a number of Oberon's lines. And so they look at I can change the spectacle text without changing the literary text by seeing what words, I think it was RSC's Midsummer that I'm thinking of. We can leave the words exactly the same, but what happens if a different character says them? We can leave the words the exact same words, but what happens? There's a production in which they have multiple Pucks, and every different character on stage will say the lines of Puck. We can do that. We have that ability to explore other ways of doing things, other ways of saying those things. What happens if it's a different character? We have the ability to change the spectacle text without changing the literary text, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. Of course, but some of the things I mentioned,
And we
If-
change texts all the time. I'm so sorry to cut you off.
yeah, no, it's okay.
We
Yes.
edit Shakespeare all the time.
Yeah.
Everybody who has ever done Shakespeare. So we're not doing anything even new. We cut whole lines out. I've never done a whole production like where we say all of the words.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, a whole Hamlet is, come on, 4.5 hours, really, right. So good point. Of course, though some people might argue, you cut a certain amount, you transpose a certain line here or there, and then you've got something that is not Shakespearean. We're getting into, I don't know, Nahum Tate's King Lear with a happy ending.
Not Shakespearean. Have you seen Men of Respect?
No.
Men of Respect is it's Macbeth, but it's set, it's in an Italian crime mob family.
Okay.
And it's one of the most brilliant productions of Macbeth I've ever seen, but it's distinctly not Shakespearean. It's 100% Macbeth, but it's not Shakespearean.
Okay, I stand corrected because right now, as soon as you said that, I'm thinking of Akira Kurosawa's film Throne of Blood, which doesn't have a single word of Macbeth in it, but it's Macbeth.
100%.
Yeah, interesting. When we're talking about this sort of thing, what about the recent, I don't know how recent it is, that the trend in, say, colorblind or gender blind, or even I've seen disability blind casting to deal with some of the issues, and of course the disproportionate number of white male roles in Shakespeare plays.
So I want to start this by starting the phrase colorblind. That is when our social movement changed. It's not great. I think I first dealt with that in the 1980s or 1990s, and the idea of colorblind. We're asking the audience to not see the bodies or the person of the actor. Why would you ask an audience not to see something? That's why we have designers. That's why we have costume designers and lighting designers. And it makes no sense that we would pretend that we're not seeing the identity that person inhabits. We've recently moved to color conscious casting, which means that the audience has to ask the question, in what way does the race, gender, ability of the person playing that role impact or inform the world in which they exist? So we're not pretending. So Ruth Negga just played Hamlet. I say just, and I mean like before the pandemic. And they're not asking a question. They're not asking the audience to see. They're not asking the audience to pretend that Ruth Negga is now white and Danish. They incorporate that she is a Black woman playing this role into the play. Now, Shakespeare, when he was writing Hamlet, may or may not have been thinking about trans issues, may or may not have been thinking about gender performance issues, but we can, directors can. When you cast Ruth Negga, you are invoking a question about what does it mean to be non-binary in the role of Hamlet? What is masculinity? What are we dealing with in terms of masculinity in Hamlet if we cast this woman? What does Blackness mean? I mean, and are you an outsider? Do other people see that you are Black? Well, of course they see you're Black because the audience sees you're Black. I think it's silly to ask the audience to not see those things.
But I'll just I think, frankly, one of the worst productions of Hamlet I've ever seen was at London's Globe some years ago, directed by Michelle Terry and starring Michelle Terry as Hamlet. And they cast as Ophelia a very tall East Indian man, Rosencrantz or Guildenstern, I can't remember which one, who can, was the actor who playing that role was deaf and signed his part. And it became incoherent, and people around me, and I know the play, the people around me who didn't know the play in the audience were at a complete loss as to what was happening. So you can see how it might tumble over and go too far. I don't know.
Well, at some point in time, are you being mean? Like I have to look at theater makers and go, are you being mean to your audience?
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
in what way are you being, are you just mad at your audience? Forcing your audience, if they don't have the signifiers to read the thing that you're putting on stage,
right.
Then I think it's cruel on some level, to whatever I put up on this stage, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And like, sometimes an audience wants to come and get lost in the story. Sometimes an audience wants, right. And when you're going, I'm going to destroy the language. And it's weird. This thing that you've just described to me is literally destroying the semiotics or the language of the stage picture.
Yeah.
So the rejecting that cacophony of symbols is a possibility. That might be what happens to the audience. And I go, you're forcing the audience then to deal with this other thing and not actually with why you chose to do that play. There must be something about that play that you wanted the audience to deal with, rather than see you throwing symbols that mean nothing. That's a different kind of theater, and that exists. Like there's Dada, there's all kinds of ways in which, but that's not always what Shakespeare was doing.
Right. Yes, I think it's a good way to put it. And if you go over the top, as that production did, it just simply didn't cohere, and the story became lost, as you put it, in the cacophony of symbols, which is a very nice sort of turn of phrase. There's another thing that's just come up again, talking about this is Shakespeare's Globe. Shakespeare's Globe is putting on Romeo and Juliet right now, and they are posting trigger warnings about the play. And many journalists and critics are bemused by this. What do you think of that sort of thing? Have we become overly sensitive? Is Shakespeare, we all read Romeo and Juliet in high school. Is Shakespeare triggering? I don't know what to make of that.
I recently directed a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at Emory and Henry College here in the United States. And while we were reading the text, the actor, Lysander has really interesting lines about two bosoms, one heart, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole series of really graphic descriptions of the female anatomy given by Lysander in that. And following that, the actors, one of the actors, the actor playing Hermia, said, I feel uncomfortable about this. I feel this. And I don't, we have reached a point in our world where we're finding language to discuss the things that we're not comfortable with. We are finding language to discuss past traumas. We are finding language to discuss lots of stuff. Sometimes that language bleeds over into areas where I don't think that's what's happening. Talking about Lysander, not that Lysander, I apologize for drifting. We got to a discussion about sexual assault, whether or not Lysander was sexually assaulting her. Right. And I went, is that possible? If that was the direction of this play, yes. But is he inherently insulting her in this scene? And I went, I don't think so. But I'm a man, I'm a cis-presenting man. So from my perspective, I can get away with it. I don't think so. But from the 20-year-old young woman who is playing Hermia, I have to honor that. Like, so this is what color conscious casting does.
Right.
This is what identity conscious casting does. We then have discussions about how we're going to shape and structure this scene. I think we as older people in theater get to the point where we're like, that's not a thing. And it might be a thing. And we have to spend some time in the rehearsal where we question how we're going to incorporate these things that trigger warnings. I think you should read the play. I think, like, if I'm going to go see Romeo and Juliet, maybe you should read it first.
Right.
Do I put in a trigger warning because somebody gets poisoned? Do I put in a trigger warning because somebody gets stabbed? Or do we now have a list or a menu of trigger warnings about things that might happen in the play that we have to warn the audience about first? I suggest reading the play before you go see it. Those are all the trigger warnings.
Okay, very good point. I mean, danger, irony, and just a quick anecdote. Many years ago, Bar on the Beach put on Titus Andronicus, and I went to see it. And sitting in the front row was a mother and father, and they brought their two young girls. I mean, these girls were like, I don't know, 12, 13, like that. I was just sitting there saying, what the are you doing here? And of course, halfway through the first half of the play, those girls are weeping and they have to be taken out. They didn't read the play. They just thought Shakespeare, elite culture, is going to be good for my daughters. Yikes.
Uh,
Let's
there
come
was a
back to
Titus Andronicus at Chicago
yeah,
Shakespeare
yeah.
a couple years, probably about a decade ago, and they said it in a butcher shop, so they're chopping,
okay. Yeah.
they are literally chopping meat on stage. It was
Oh,
the
man.
bloodiest production of Titus I've ever seen.
Man. Let's come back to your own sort of experience with acting and stuff. And you played Othello, and you also coined this term, Othellophobia. Could you explain what that is, what that means?
Othellophobia. Did I say that?
Yes, you did. I tracked it down.
I think when I'm talking about Othellophobia, it's here in America, we have a history of performing Othello. I'm fascinated by the American history of performing Othello through the period of enslavement of African Americans in this country. There were over 280 productions of Othello. So,
wow.
Right. And so there's an interesting thing where you're like, why is Othello happening so often? Why? And I think it's because we here in America have a really complicated history, racial history of race. And black and white relationships, and it includes the period of enslavement, and so many things. But where we are now in this country, we get to the point where we're like, are we afraid of talking about race? Are we afraid of addressing? Are we afraid of saying that the thing is the thing it is?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that people necessarily know how to. I know people who have tried desperately to put on productions of Othello and not make it about race, which is complicated and
Mm-hmm.
wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
it may not be about being African American. In fact, most certainly is not about being African American. I think it's about being other, and how you choose to represent that racial other is laden with potholes and not meaning, and ending up saying things that you don't think you meant to say. So I think there's a distancing. I think Othellophobia is tied with I don't have the right words. I'm not going to say this eloquently, and I'm going to make a generalization, but the inherent fear of Black masculinity and Black men, that is a different discussion in our society. So I think that's what I was talking about, and that's what those two things are about.
And I like your notion of otherness, because certainly when I teach the play, I focus a lot on his last speech where he says, I smote the uncircumcised Turk, thus, and then kills himself. So he sort of aligns himself as a protector of the white Venetian state, but also as the other, the threat, and he kills himself. Yeah, interesting. You've also played Shylock.
Yes.
Yeah, how was that?
I played Shylock for the Arizona Repertory Theater Company, and it was. I cannot remember the director's name, but it was a Jewish man who was directing the show.
Mm-hmm.
We were in Arizona. We were in Tucson, Arizona. I played Shylock. The only other African-American theater student, male student, played Tubal. There was a Latin woman who played my daughter, Julia. And everybody else in the show was white. This was so they represented otherness, or they represented Jewish identity through Black skin or Black and brown skin.
Right.
And that was I thought it was interesting because they wanted to visualize what other, they wanted a visual symbolic marker of the other.
Mm-hmm.
and I don't necessarily think I was terribly successful. I think I did a bad job because I didn't do it. I thought my research about Jewish identity was lacking. I could have done more research to figure out what that meant for me as an actor. But it was an interesting thing, and it was weird. We in that production, there was one evening. It ran for I don't know how long, but one evening, a group of Jewish lawyers in the city of Tucson bought the house out.
Okay.
And so the entire audience, for the first time,
Right.
was filled with just Jewish audience members. And it was fascinating because all of the laughs that we had gotten used to hearing weren't in the places. Like, there were brand new things.
Mhm.
Our relationship with the audience changed 100%, and it threw a number of people on stage because many people thought they had been the good guy. Many people thought, because of the laughter of the audience,
Yeah.
a number of actors felt like they were a part of the audience, and them were a we. I remember this one particular performance in front of the Jewish Lawyers Association,
Mhm.
and I was like, oh, I now understand what it means to feel a part of the audience. There had been applause when in other performances there had been applause when the bailiffs would walk me, Shylock, off stage. There was a silence like none I had ever heard before when the bailiffs walked me off in front of that audience. So the racial identity of the audience was a part of this theater event / experience, and it was amazing.
Wow. And of course, a lot of productions of Merchant of Venice now include some sort of coda, a spectacle of Shylock being forced conversion of Shylock. And I think I saw a production again at the Globe in London, where this went on for a long time, right? And he having to say the credo, I believe. What do you think about something like that?
What are you doing to your audience? I will always return
Okay.
to the audience,
Yeah.
and I go, what do you do? And I think it's really interesting because if the audience becomes self-reflexive and
Mhm.
starts to question its own inhumanity, we live at a time right now where, maybe because of the stress of the pandemic and various other things, we're having these little friction moments where people who normally stay in their own lane are yelling at each other on the street. The control of society is slipping, and people are just yelling at each other on the street. And so in an audience, it becomes interesting. What are you doing to your audience? Are you trying to make your audience feel guilty? Are you trying to make your audience feel like they are a part of forcing the conversion of Shylock? Are you trying to hurt your audience? If so, why? Are you trying to give your audience a cathartic experience? If so, why? What is your intention as the theater maker?
Right. That's really interesting. We only have a few more minutes before going to questions. So I'm going to ask a few sort of more lighter questions because we've dealt with some big issues here. First of all, I know you have an interest in the cultural significance of superheroes. Does that ever work your way into thinking about Shakespeare? I mean, there are comic novels like Kill Shakespeare, where the characters from Shakespeare's plays become sort of superheroes.
I will think, like I said, Midsummer Night's Dream. I love magic. I think about the superhero genre in which we can explore the being of anything in plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I go, great. So I've done this when I direct Midsummer Night's Dream. I think of Oberon as thunder, and our biggest visual referent for that is I go, Thor. Have you ever watched Storm of the X-Men or Thor of the Avengers, when they fly and they make the clouds surround them? And I go, yes, that's Oberon.
There you go.
That thing that you're doing right there, that's Oberon. And I watch a volcano or somebody who has the ability to wield fire, and I go, there's a Titania. Like, so when I start to direct that particular play, superhero reference is 100% a part of how I use that to talk to the actors.
Okay, thank you so much, Ray. We're now going to go to questions, and Mary has is going to curate them for us.
Hi.
Hi,
So
Mary.
a quick pragmatic one that one of our attendees has asked is, when casting, does a modern director now cast according to message or according to audition quality of the actor?
Message, I'd like to tailor the word message. I think about the spectacle text that they intend to create. What is the story you are telling? Step back. The director's job is to step back and view the spectacle and figure out what story they are telling intentionally, right? Casting, and it's more complicated than that, because one of the arguments in casting right now has, well, we've simply cast the best actor for the part. How do we determine best? If we're looking at Juliet's, the image of a young white woman with flowing blonde hair, how has our society coded the idea of innocence? I can look at that racially, and I can go, there's a history of how we make an audience think somebody is innocent, and how we make an audience think somebody is innocent, and that has to do with race. So we are hiding something when we say the best actor for a part. That's my thought on that.
Awesome. A lot of folks want to hear you talk more, both of you, about what we mean by Shakespearean. So, for example, Kurosawa's work. Someone's also asking about if we're deviating from the actual language, what are we losing? And I'm not sure you're suggesting that we deviate from the language, but there was a question about that. And then finally, another attendee asked, when Boulder cleaned up Shakespeare to suit or shape Victorian sensibilities, there was also a fashion for happy endings for Lear and for Romeo and Juliet. We now see this as and for Othello, yes. So we now see this as reprehensible, but can you all talk about how what we're doing now is different from that?
Paul, I'll let you start.
Thank you, Ray. I certainly hope it's different. Bowdlerization, where you took the naughty bits out of Shakespeare and simply took them out, which is something that persisted well into the 20th century, at least in high school editions of Shakespeare, was just sort of a puritanical, Victorian distaste or unease with human sexuality, or at least open discussion of human sexuality in general. And I do remember, as a university student, with a book of plays, wasn't Shakespeare, what was medieval drama that I had, and it had been Bowdlerized, and all the dirty bits had been put at the back of the book, which meant if you turned to the back of the book, you had pages of filth, right? So what's going on now, the sort of language changes, which Ray has talked a bit about and which we've seen at Bar on the Beach, aren't an attempt to censor the language of the text, but rather to orient it in new ways that may be significant for our understanding of the issues that these plays raise. What happened with the sort of rewriting of Shakespeare entirely with happy endings and stuff, this is something that happened in the Restoration, the 18th century, when Shakespeare's verse, etc., was considered vulgar, primitive, and literature was supposed to teach simple morals, which Shakespeare sometimes failed to do. Ray, from there?
So I think about it when the sensibilities of a society, again, during the Restoration, during even the Victorian era, they didn't want to, they wanted happy endings. The audience wanted to laugh. And it's really interesting because if you rewrite the end of Othello, so that there during the, I think it's, somewhere between in the 1810s, there's a version of Othello in which he's not black. And it's a really interesting thing because there's no longer, you've changed the story in such a way that the problem in the story is gone. When you do things, when you give, people didn't want tragedies, so they would get, there's a version of Lear where no one dies and everybody has, and it's a happy ending. And I go, yes, you're changing the text in the same way that we are discussing changing the text, but are you changing the yes, you're changing the what. There's a Romeo and Juliet don't die. And it's really interesting. You go, okay, cool. So thank you. I've talked myself into how I want to answer. If Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy and we are going to experience some sort of a catharsis or loss at the end because two people did whatever they did, cool. If they both live and they get married and there's a happily ever after, there's something missing from the play causing me to go, well, why are we doing it? Is that different? So what they were doing during the Restoration, during the Victorian period, is that different than what we're doing now? I think so. And I would advocate for being true to the text. I really do believe that we don't have to change. We edit words all the time. Do we change them? Can I give them to different characters? I think the answer is yes. I think Shakespeare is 400 years old and I'm not beholden to him. Weirdly, because we as a society were forced to learn Shakespeare. Great. We're going to take him, and much like Icarus going to steal fire from the gods and give it to the people, I'm going to go and I'm going to take some Shakespeare and I'm going to take it and I'm going to do something. I'm going to give it to the people. And once you've given it to the people, that fire spreads in such a way that they will use it to warm their individual campfires the way they will. We don't get control over that.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble gathering my thoughts after that because that was so huge and powerful. Yeah. I'm about to start weeping. Thank you. Very grateful to you for that, Ray. That meant a lot to me. Here's a question for you, though, from one of our attendees who wishes us a good day. She says, in the last few years, I've seen 2 productions of Julius Caesar in which the title role was played by a woman. For me, that was a step too far. Am I too hidebound?
Ray, what do you think?
I think women are beginning to explore and push the boundaries, the social boundaries or societal boundaries that have been imposed upon them for a very, very long time. I'm working on a play right now, and so we're exploring what it meant, the box of what being a woman was. And I think that I don't want to speak for women because I've found that to be wildly dangerous. But I think pushing boundaries and going, what am I allowed to be in this society? Can I be? And I think Julius Caesar is fine. Can Julius Caesar be an exploration of the limitations or boundaries society puts on a woman? I think yes. And not an individual woman, but the idea of what a woman can be. I think, yeah, I could explore gender and the limitations of gender roles through a production of Julius Caesar. When we ask questions like, I'm in America where we still haven't ever elected a female president. And I think it's because we as a society, there are parts of our society that don't believe women have it's not my own opinion, but there are thoughts where people are like, can a woman be the leader of a country? That's a real question. Mm-hmm. And I go, why is her gender? Why does that matter? When we ask female candidates running for the office of president, when we make them, well, you're too shrewish, or you're not pretty enough, or you're not likable, or whatever, those are horrifying things to say, but they all still exist. And so, can a woman be a Julius Caesar? I might use Julius Caesar to explore that.
All right, for our final question, because I think that's all we have time for. Yep. Is it possible to see Shakespeare in everything?
In Norwegian death metal, for example.
I can, but do I want to? I think narratives, all narratives, I'm constantly, no one wants to go to the movies with me because I'm constantly reading stories. Here, one of the questions that gets us, during the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Brown Simpson murder trial, somebody said to me at one point in time, they were like, can there ever be a Black man dating a white woman and it's not Othello and Desdemona? And I don't have an answer for that, but Othello and Desdemona become a shorthand. The tragedy of Othello and Desdemona became weirdly a way of shorthanding OJ and Nicole Brown Simpson. It's this weird shorthanding. We can make things small. We can convey a lot of ideas very quickly through Shakespeare. Do I see Shakespeare in everything? No, I don't. But I think it's a product of it became a part of our educational system. So we are always seeing it because of the educational system. That's my very bad answer to that question.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up now and let you all know, first of all, I just want to extend such a huge thank you to you, Paul, and to you, Ray, for a fantastic, illuminating discussion. And for those of you who are curious if you might be able to view this again or pass it on to others, yes, we're working on that. We will update you soon. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in and remind you that this is the first in a series of Bard Explored events. Please tune in for the rest. You can find details on our website, bardonthebeach.org. And while you're there, be sure to buy tickets for Done Undone. It's an original work commissioned by Bard, written by Kate Besworth, directed by Arti Chandra, and starring Harveen Sandhu and Charlie Gallant, playing a great variety of characters who will inspire you and intrigue you and challenge you and really give you fantastic stories to ponder. Before we have to say goodbye, I just want to say thank you again, Paul, Ray, Ava, everyone who's been here. Until next time, farewell.
Thank you, and bye-bye. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you both.